So how much is Warhammer 40k about good generalship, and how much is it about how much money you're willing to sink into the hobby? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about the concept of pay to win, and how much it affects Warhammer 40k at the moment. I'm sure there'll be plenty of strong opinions on this, but I think it's perhaps a bit reductive to say that yes, Warhammer is all about paying to win, and maybe a bit naive to say that it isn't a factor at all. We'll start out with a bit of a general discussion, some of the main negatives and factors that perpetuate paying to win, maybe a few counterpoints to why it's not quite such a big deal, and a few thoughts as to how you might be able to mitigate it a bit, either as an individual player or us as a community. So obviously, being pay to win isn't exactly a positive for a game. It brings up the connotations of cheap mobile games, where you technically can pay for either very low cost or completely free, but if you're willing to dump loads of money into it, then you're going to obliterate the competition, and just get a whole load of advantages that other people on a budget aren't going to be able to. I think it's hard to argue that it's a good thing for any sort of strategy game. Really, in a tournament setting, you'd like to see the best general win rather than the general with the biggest wallet. I think perhaps Warhammer 40k is a little bit less cut and dry than, say, mobile games like that, or maybe even other games such as Magic the Gathering, mainly because the vast majority of people don't just literally buy models for game rules. Warhammer's of course a many-faceted hobby, and you'll often want to buy a model just for the looks, the lore, or any interesting projects that you can do with assembly and painting them. I feel that this at least muddies the water a little bit, and it means that most models that you buy aren't just literally going to have value for winning the game of 40k. You'd also get the enjoyment of the assembly, painting, and how they look on the tabletop. I feel that how big an effect it had is somewhat debatable, and still certainly vary from person to person and how much you're willing to spend on having the best Warhammer army ever. Back before 8th edition, things didn't really tend to change too much. Games Workshop didn't do any sort of regular points balance updates, so once you bought something, you could pretty much be guaranteed that it'd be strong for a very long time. Now with 8th and 9th edition, things changed quite a bit. Points seem to get readjusted twice a year, even on top of codexes and things coming out. And if you want to have the very best Warhammer army that's stomping tournaments, it's generally going to change month to month and year to year, and the spending would likely be more about keeping up with the changes. I guess theoretically you could go the whole hog of every time a new codex drops that looks really powerful, you could buy an entire new 2,000 point army list. But I think in reality very few people have the time, money or inclination to bother doing that, and most people tend to fall along the lines of already having an established army, and when they get some sort of update they might add a unit or two to keep their list being at least relatively strong and competitive with the other factions. I still feel that could have a pretty powerful effect though. If you had two players with pretty much identical armies, and then one player chooses not to update anything, and the other one sees a balance update and adds in the new strongest unit in the codex, then they're pretty much guaranteed to have an advantage. Even with a fair bit of spending though, you're certainly not guaranteed to win every game. There's a ton of skill involved in Warhammer, both with list building with the armies that you have, and of course commanding the units that you're playing on the table. You can buy and assemble the list that won the last tournament, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll know how to use it optimally. I feel at least compared with 8th edition, 9th edition is a bit more complex in the decisions that you have to make. Rather than just focusing on wiping the enemy off the table, you also have to prioritise against scoring secondaries and holding primaries. Most lists tend to be a bit more complicated rather than just spamming one or two really strong things, and there's definitely a lot of scope for playing a really good list less well. In any case, even if it isn't absolutely all-consuming, having an element of pay to win isn't exactly ideal either. It certainly can be a bit demoralising just getting shot off the table by the flavour of the month army, particularly if it's just a new creation that someone's gone out to buy a whole load of fancy units for. Even if things aren't quite as extreme as that though, it still can be a bit of pressure. I think sometimes it could have the potential to lead to some difficulty if there's a gaming group where standards are gradually rising slightly, leading to a bit of an arms race between buying different units for different armies to counter each other. Could perhaps just lead to a less healthy environment if people are trying to play the game on different levels of competitiveness. I think being part of a slightly more competitive gaming group could put a bit of pressure to buy models that you don't particularly like the look of, or even just spend a bit more money than you'd ideally like to, just to stay in the game and be competing with the other players. I don't think that it's something that Games Workshop's ever going to make a massive amount of effort to address. It's just not entirely in Games Workshop's interest to discourage a bit of element of pay to win within their game, though I think ideally they also don't want things getting completely skewed and leading to a lot of people abandoning the game if their army just isn't able to compete with others. I believe that in the past, before these more recent editions, Games Workshop perhaps didn't have quite as good a handle on what's good or what's bad within their game. Now in 8th and 9th edition, with their regular balance updates, I feel that they do have a bit more of a handle on it, and they do tend to be able to put most of their more recent releases to be a bit stronger than some of the standard stuff, either at the day of release, or maybe even just at the next balance pass. Maybe for example, when the Phobos stuff came out in the Shadowspear box, Eliminators weren't particularly exciting then, and then they suddenly got to be one of the strongest units in the game in the new Space Marine Codex. Between encouraging the sales of new models and then just doing regular rule shake-ups when some older things get very good all of a sudden, I think Games Workshop aims just to put a little bit more pressure on hobbyists, so the majority of players' armies still always have units to buy that are likely to make their army just that little bit stronger. Now, any crafty things done by Games Workshop aside, I think there are at least a few arguments that say that pay to win isn't necessarily the biggest deal for Warhammer. And maybe the most obvious argument is that pay to win tends to exist in almost every game or thing that humans compete in, whether that's sports, online gaming, or basically anything else that's done as a hobby. Generally, if you can afford the very best gear, it is going to put you at a slight advantage, though it does kind of depend on the activity for just how much of an advantage it's going to grant you, whether it's some really fancy golf clubs, or a top-end gaming PC, or even if you wanted just to get good at a game that's basically entirely free to play like chess, you could still put a whole load of money in getting coaching if you wanted, and maybe develop your skills far faster than other people without those resources would have. It's perhaps just a little bit more noticeable in Warhammer, because the actual rules for the actual things that you can use in-game are directly tied to the price. As I said in the first bit as well, if you're playing Warhammer you are likely spending money anyway, none of the armies are free to play at all, and you are getting other value out of the miniature purchases. While you certainly could increase your chances by spending loads of money, depending on exactly what you buy, you certainly could spend a lot more money than someone even with a top-tier competitive army and wind up with an army far worse than theirs. Generally speaking though, if you're mainly buying models just for the rules, you are going to wind up spending a lot more money if you're trying to keep a few armies in top-tier competitive form, as opposed to fielding slightly less optimal lists of things that you already have. I would also say that Games Workshop's slightly random rebalancing rules don't always work against you. If you've got a reasonable collection, you might suddenly see some of the units that aren't all that strong suddenly become absolutely top tier. I'm sure that was a pleasant surprise for long-term Deathwing players. Full Deathwing armies hadn't really been a proper strong thing for editions now. And then when Dark Angels suddenly get transhuman on every unit, they suddenly became one of the stronger options in the game. Despite this, I would say that pay to win is an issue that does hold back people in 40k, and certainly will be one of the factors that separates people at top tournaments. If you have two people who are great at the game, and one's got literally the best combination of units and the other one is slightly suboptimal, then generally that other player is going to have an advantage. Other than just spending money though, I think there are a fair few ways that you can help lessen the blow. As an individual, when planning purchases, I would think about building a resilient collection that's not necessarily just the strongest thing now, but is also likely to stand the test of time when things do inevitably wind up changing. If one niche unit suddenly becomes the best thing, and it makes sense to have absolutely tons of them, you do run the risk of being left in the dust when they're nerfed. I'd say maybe Adeptus Mechanicus Ironstrider Ballistari are perhaps a good example of this. Random fast attack chicken walkers that have suddenly and slightly randomly been catapulted to being one of the strongest gunline units in all of Warhammer 40k. There's certainly no guarantee that they'll be good whenever the next AdMech Codex drops, and they might even catch a hefty nerf before then if Games Workshop does think that they're a bit oppressive and are too much of an obvious choice. While I'd certainly not be against acquiring a few of those for a new AdMech army, I'd also focus on their more central choices, things that are likely to be good in and out, certainly core HQs and troops, things that are likely to be part of any AdMech army going forward. I'd also try and be prepared for when things do move on. If you are buying expensive kits like the Ironstriders, it might be worth magnetising bits where possible. Being able to swap them out for Sindonian Dragoons would be quite nice if they suddenly got strong, or at least just keeping the bits and pieces so you could do a bit of chopping and changing with plastic shears if you did want to rearm them at a later date. When competing in tournaments, if you're part of a gaming group, you could think about some lending or borrowing of models. Top players often tend to compete as teams, and if a few players clutch the strongest army, you might be able to rustle up one army between the lot of them of all the strongest stuff spammed to the max. A good support network is an advantage that most of the top players will enjoy, and is a good advantage that they'll have over individual hobbyists going to events. I'd also advise very rarely ever just jumping straight on the bandwagon for an army when it drops from its codex, unless you really want to get the faction anyway. Then often by the time you've actually got round to building up a 2,000 point army, times are likely to have moved on. There might have been a new points readjustment, and a ton of other codexes might have been released that make the older flavour of the month army seem not quite as bad. I think combating pay to win can also be something that's done as a community, maybe being a little bit more accepting of either proxied or budgeted alternative models, and maybe not being quite as draconian as Games Workshop are in their own events about what does or doesn't get played. Obviously things have to be clear to all people playing, but absolute and complete enforcement of WYSIWYG whenever events happen, I do feel is kind of playing into Games Workshop's hands a bit. In the community, as always, I would try and suit the game to the person that you're playing against a bit. I do really enjoy playing competitive 40k games, but I do fully admit that a more casual gaming group might spend a whole ton less money and still enjoy the games of 40k just as much. Finally, in the digital world, Tabletop Simulator can be a great leveler, as you can basically create rosters of exactly what you want, and you can try out and play with the most powerful options without having to pay the sometimes exorbitant price tag. It's not a system that's going to work for everyone though, and I do wonder if Games Workshop might have a clamp down on it at some point, due to being a competitor to their tabletop game. So anyway, I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts and ideas on the subject. Is Warhammer 40k a pay-to-win game, and if so, then how important is the pay-to-win aspect? If you've enjoyed the discussion and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new videos out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly and you'd like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Making all these videos does take a ton of time, and if you are enjoying, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.